All right, so get this. Today we're diving deep into climate change. But not just the usual stuff. We're going way beyond melting glaciers and all that. We're going to be looking at how climate change is affecting, like, everything. Thanks to you guys sending in this research paper. It's called A Review on Climate Change Impacts, Models, and Its Consequences on Different Sectors. A Systematic Approach. Catchy title, right?
Well, it gets the point across. And what's really cool is that the researchers, they really went deep on this. They looked at how climate change is affecting stuff like agriculture, tourism, even our health.
So like the whole shebang?
Yeah, pretty
Yeah.
much. And they didn't use some outdated data either. We're
Yeah.
talking data from the last 23 years, so it's really up to date.
Wow, okay, so this is an ancient history. We're working with fresh intel here.
Mm.
I got to admit, when I hear climate change, my brain automatically jumps to those
Yeah.
apocalyptic images of like glaciers crashing into the ocean and, wildfires raging out of
Yeah,
control.
the dramatic stuff.
Exactly. But this paper goes way beyond that, right?
Right. Oh, absolutely. One of the things that really jumped out at me was how fast sea levels are rising. Like, we're talking faster than earlier predictions had suggested.
Wow. That's kind of scary. It makes you think, like, are coastal communities even ready for that kind of change?
That's the million-dollar question,
Oh.
and it's something every coastal region needs to be thinking about right now.
Yeah, for sure. But okay, so we've got rising sea levels, but the paper also goes into how climate change is affecting other areas too, right?
Yeah.
Like things we might not think of right away,
Right.
like agriculture, for instance.
Yeah, agriculture is a big one.
So how exactly is a warming planet going to affect the food we eat?
Well, the paper uses wheat as an example.
Yeah.
And it's not looking good.
Oh no, what's going on with wheat?
Well, they're predicting reduced yields, lower quality grain, and increased pressure from pests and diseases.
Ugh, that sounds like a nightmare for wheat farmers.
It is, and it's not just the farmers who will feel it. Think about the impact on food prices and availability for everyone.
Right, it's a global issue. Okay, so we've got rising sea levels and struggling wheat farmers.
Mm-hmm.
What else is on the climate change hit list?
Well, the paper also digs into how climate change is messing with our water resources.
Water that's essential.
Absolutely essential.
So what's happening there?
Basically, climate change is affecting the entire water cycle. Warmer temperatures mean more evaporation, which messes with rainfall patterns, and that can have a domino effect on river flows and the overall availability of fresh water.
Yikes. The paper uses India as a case study for this, doesn't it?
It does. India is already facing some serious water scarcity issues.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. Billions of people relying on dwindling water resources.
And it's not just a problem for places that are already dry like India. Even if you live in a region with plenty of water, think about the global implications. When water scarcity starts affecting food production industries, even political stability, it's a problem for everyone.
Right, it's all connected. Okay, so we've covered rising sea level, struggling wheat farmers, and dwindling water resources. Anything else we need to be worried about?
Well, you know how we were talking about climate change affecting our health earlier?
Yeah.
Most people immediately think of heat waves.
Right, makes sense.
But it goes beyond that.
Oh.
The paper talks about how rising temperatures can worsen air quality, leading to more respiratory problems.
That makes sense.
And there's also a connection between climate change and the spread of infectious diseases.
Now that's scary.
There was one stat in the paper that really stuck with me. Apparently, climate change is expanding the range of the mosquitoes that carry dengue fever, putting billions of people at risk.
Wow, that's a serious public health crisis waiting to happen.
Mhm.
Okay, so climate change is affecting the planet, our food, our water, and now our health. Is there anything left untouched?
Well, the paper also talks about the impact on biodiversity.
Oh yeah, of course. Plants and animals.
Exactly. Climate change is pushing countless species towards extinction. Habitats are being destroyed, migration patterns are disrupted. Competition for resources is getting more intense.
It's like a whole ecosystem upheaval. I read somewhere that 57% of butterfly species in Europe have shifted their ranges northward because of climate change. It seems like a small thing, butterflies,
Yeah.
But it's really a sign of how much the whole ecosystem is being affected.
It's like a domino effect. One change triggers another and another. And ultimately, biodiversity loss affects us too.
Right, we're all part of the same web of life.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got the planet, the food, the water, the health, and the ecosystems all being impacted by climate change.
Yeah.
And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, there's the economic fallout.
Oh, yeah. The economic costs are huge, and they're only going to get bigger.
The paper talks about the potential for damage across all sorts of sectors, right?
It does agriculture, energy, infrastructure.
One stat that really blew my mind was the prediction that the annual cost of coastal flooding could reach $100 billion by 2100.
Yeah, it's a lot of zeros.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that kind of number. Okay, so climate change is hitting us in the wallet too. What about forests? They play a pretty important role in all of this, don't they?
Absolutely. Forests are like giant sponges soaking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
Right. They're crucial for regulating the climate.
Exactly. But climate change is putting forests at risk in a few ways. Deforestation is increasing the risk of wildfires is going up, and tree mortality rates are rising.
So climate change is weakening the very thing that helps protect us from it.
That's right.
The paper mentions South Asia being particularly vulnerable to these effects, doesn't it?
It does. South Asia's forests are really on the front lines of climate change.
So we've got rising sea levels, struggling wheat farmers, dwindling water resources, threatened ecosystems, a looming public health crisis, a shaky global economy, and disappearing forests.
Is there anything climate change isn't affecting?
Well, there's one more sector the paper touches on that you might not expect.
Okay, hit me with it. What is it?
Tourism.
Tourism, really?
Think about it. A lot of popular tourist destinations rely on specific weather conditions.
Yeah.
Ski resorts need snow. Coastal resorts need beaches. Ecotourism relies on thriving ecosystems. Climate change is messing with all of that. You know, I was actually planning a trip a few years back to go see some glaciers, and then I read that they might be gone in a decade.
Wow.
It was a real wake-up call. Like, climate change is already affecting the places we dream of visiting.
That's a perfect example. And the paper mentions other impacts too, like shorter ski seasons and beach erosion at coastal resorts.
It's like climate change is coming for our vacations now.
It kind of is.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. And it's pretty clear that climate change is a complex issue with consequences that reach into every corner of our lives. But now I'm curious about the role of climate models in all of this. How do scientists actually go about predicting what's going to happen in the future?
Oh, it's not like they have a crystal ball. They use these incredibly complex computer models to simulate the Earth's climate system.
They're basically building virtual Earths to run experiments on.
You could say that. They use these models, things like global climate models, which are basically like giant SimCity simulations for the entire planet.
Yeah.
And they use them to try and predict how different factors will affect the climate.
So things like greenhouse gas emissions, population growth, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. And they even factor in technological advancements, too.
So they're running all sorts of different scenarios, best case, worst case, to see what the future might hold.
Exactly.
That must require some serious computing power.
It does. These models are incredibly complex. And they use other tools, too, like Geographic Information Systems, or GIS, to visualize the data so they can see how specific areas could be affected.
It all sounds very high-tech.
Mm.
But the paper also points out that even with all this technology, there's still a lot of uncertainty.
Right.
So how much can we really rely on these models to predict the future?
That's a fair question, and the truth is that the climate system is so complex, even the most advanced models have their limitations.
So it's not an exact science,
Not exactly.
but I guess it's better to have some idea of what we're facing, even if it's not perfect.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Even with the uncertainties, these models give us a range of possibilities, and that's enough to inform our actions. Knowing the potential risks, even if they're not set in stone, is crucial for planning and decision-making.
Okay, that makes sense. So knowing what we know about the potential impacts of climate change, what can we actually do about it? Does the paper offer any solutions?
It does. It emphasizes a two-pronged approach: adaptation and mitigation.
Break that down for me. What's the difference?
Think of it like treating a patient. Adaptation is managing the symptoms while mitigation is going after the underlying disease.
Okay, I like that analogy.
So in the case of climate change, adaptation is about adjusting to the changes that are already happening or are likely to happen in the future. It's about figuring out how to live with those changes.
So like learning to cope with the new reality.
Exactly.
And what about mitigation?
Mitigation is about tackling the root cause of the problem, reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
So adaptation is about dealing with the consequences, and mitigation is about preventing things from getting worse. It seems like we need both, right?
We absolutely do. It's not an either situation. The paper is very clear on that we need to be doing both simultaneously.
Okay, I'm getting it. But can you give me some real-world examples of what these adaptation and mitigation strategies might look like?
Sure. On the adaptation side, we're talking about things like developing drought-resistant crops, which we talked about earlier.
Right.
It also includes things like improving water management systems and building seawalls to protect coastal communities.
So Basically becoming more resilient in the face of a changing climate.
Exactly.
And what about mitigation? How do we go about reducing those greenhouse gas emissions?
There are a lot of ways. We can transition to renewable energy sources like solar and wind power. We can improve energy efficiency in our homes and buildings. And we can promote sustainable transportation options like walking, biking, and public transit.
Those are all big changes, though.
They are, but they're necessary.
The paper also mentioned something called green banking. I have to admit, I'm not familiar with that term.
Green banking is basically when banks decide to stop funding polluting industries, and instead they pour money into eco-friendly businesses.
So they're using their financial clout to steer us in a more sustainable direction.
Precisely.
That's pretty cool, actually.
And it's not just about big banks and corporations. Individuals can get involved too by choosing to invest in sustainable funds or by supporting businesses that are committed to reducing their environmental impact.
Okay, that's something I can get behind. It's empowering to know that we're not powerless in this situation. But, this whole discussion, while fascinating, has also been pretty overwhelming at times. It's easy to feel a sense of doom and gloom when you think about the scale of the problem.
I understand it's a lot to take in, and feeling overwhelmed is a natural response, but I think it's crucial to remember that we're not alone in this. There are millions of people around the world working on solutions, and their efforts are making a difference.
That's a good point. It's about focusing on what we can do, both individually and collectively,
Right.
rather than getting bogged down in despair.
Exactly.
And it's not just about grand gestures either. It's about those small, everyday choices that add up over time, like choosing to walk instead of drive, eating less meat, supporting local businesses that prioritize sustainability,
Right. It's about making conscious choices that align with our values.
and fostering a sense of hope and optimism. We have the knowledge and the technology to address climate change. What we need now is the collective will to act.
Well said.
Now, before we wrap up, I have to ask, what are your final thoughts on the paper itself? Anything that particularly stood out to you as interesting or thought-provoking?
You know what I found interesting was the paper's focus on the scientific and economic aspects of climate change, but what it doesn't really delve into are the social and political dimensions of this issue.
Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by the social and political dimensions?
Well, for example, the paper doesn't really address the issue of climate justice.
Climate justice. I'm not familiar with that term.
It's the idea that those who have contributed the least to climate change are often the ones most impacted by its effects.
So you're saying there's an element of fairness or lack thereof involved in this whole issue?
Exactly. It raises questions about responsibility, equity, and the distribution of burdens and benefits when it comes to tackling climate change.
Like, who should bear the cost of adaptation and mitigation efforts?
Exactly.
And how do we make sure that solutions don't actually make existing inequalities worse?
Right. Those are all crucial questions.
Wow, that's a whole other layer of complexity. It's not just about science and economics. It's about social justice and global equity.
Precisely. And it's something that we need to be talking about more.
It sounds like there's a lot more to unpack here.
It's more like they're building these incredibly complex simulations, like a virtual Earth. Yeah, and these simulations, they're called global climate models. It's kind of like a giant sim city for the whole planet. And they use these models to try and predict how different things will affect the climate. Things like greenhouse gas emissions, population growth, even technological advancements.
So they're running all these different what ifs.
Yeah, exactly. They're trying to figure out what the future might look like under different conditions. And they use other tools too, like geographic information systems or GIS. It helps them visualize the data and see how specific areas could be affected.
Okay, so it's not just plugging numbers into a calculator. It's pretty high-tech stuff.
It is. But, even with all this technology, the paper points out that there's still a lot of uncertainty.
Right, because the climate is a pretty complex system.
It is. And even the most advanced models have their limitations.
So it's not like we can predict the future with 100% accuracy.
Not exactly.
But I guess having some idea of what we're facing is better than nothing, right?
Absolutely. These models give us a range of possibilities.
Yeah.
And that's enough to inform our actions,
Right? Knowing the potential risks, even if they're not set in stone, can help us prepare.
Exactly. It's crucial for planning and decision making.
Okay, that makes sense. So knowing what we know about the potential impacts of climate change, what can we actually do about it? Does the paper offer any solutions?
It does. It emphasizes a two-pronged approach, adaptation and mitigation.
Okay, I've heard those terms before, but can you refresh my memory? What's the difference?
Sure, think of it like treating a patient. Adaptation is like managing the symptoms while mitigation is going after the underlying disease.
Okay, I like that analogy. So in the context of climate change, what would adaptation look like?
It's about adjusting to the changes that are already happening or are likely to happen in the future, figuring out how to live with a new reality.
So like learning to cope with more extreme weather events. And
Exactly.
what about mitigation?
Mitigation is about addressing the root cause of the problem, reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
So adaptation is about dealing with the consequences, and mitigation is about preventing things from getting worse.
You got it.
It seems like we need both, right?
We absolutely do. It's not an either situation. The paper is very clear on that we need to be doing both simultaneously.
Got it. Can you give me some real-world examples of what these adaptation and mitigation strategies might look like?
Sure, on the adaptation side, we're talking about things like developing drought-resistant crops, which we touched on earlier.
Right.
It also includes things like improving water management systems and building seawalls to protect coastal communities.
So making ourselves more resilient.
Exactly.
And what about mitigation? How do we go about reducing those greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, there are a lot of ways. We can transition to renewable energy sources like solar and wind power. We can improve energy efficiency in our homes and buildings. And we can promote sustainable transportation options like walking, biking, and public transit.
Those are all pretty big changes, though.
They are, but they're necessary.
The paper also mentions something called green banking. I have to admit, I'm not really familiar with that term.
Green banking is basically when banks decide to stop funding polluting industries. And instead, they invest in eco-friendly businesses.
Ah, okay, so they're using their financial power to push us in a more sustainable direction.
Exactly.
That's a pretty interesting concept.
And it's not just about big banks and corporations either. Individuals can get involved too by choosing to invest in sustainable funds or by supporting businesses that are committed to reducing their environmental impact.
Okay, so there are things we can do at the individual level as well.
Absolutely.
This whole discussion has been really eye-opening, but it's also been pretty overwhelming at times. It's easy to feel kind of helpless when you think about the scale of this problem.
I understand. It's a lot to take in, and it's natural to feel overwhelmed. But I think it's important to remember that we're not alone in this. There are millions of people around the world working on solutions, and their efforts are making a difference.
That's a good reminder. It's about focusing on what we can do rather than getting bogged down in despair.
Exactly.
And, it's not just about grand gestures either. It's about those small everyday choices that we make,
Like what kind of choices?
like choosing to walk instead of drive, eating less meat, supporting local businesses that are environmentally conscious.
Right. It's about making those small changes that add up over time.
Exactly, and it's about fostering a sense of hope and optimism. We have the knowledge and the technology to address climate change. What we need now is the collective will to act.
Well said.
So before we wrap up, I'm curious, what are your final thoughts on the paper itself? Anything that particularly stood out to you as interesting or thought-provoking?
Well, one thing that struck me was the paper's emphasis on the scientific and economic aspects of climate change. But what it doesn't really address are the social and political dimensions of the issue.
Interesting. Can you elaborate on that a bit? What do you mean by social and political dimensions?
Well, for example, the paper doesn't really talk about climate justice.
Climate justice. I'm
Yeah.
not familiar with that term.
It's the idea that the people who have contributed the least to climate change are often the ones who are most affected by it.
Ah, I see. So it's about who bears the brunt of the problem.
Exactly. It raises questions about responsibility and fairness.
Right. Like who should pay for the solutions?
Exactly. And how do we make sure that those solutions don't actually make existing inequalities worse?
That's a really important point.
It is, and it's something we need to be thinking about more.
So it's not just about science and economics. It's also about social justice.
Precisely.
It sounds like there's a lot more to unpack here. It really is.
Hmm.
There's a lot to think about. This whole deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening, but it's also left me with a lot of questions. Like, where do we go from here? What can our listeners do to learn more about all of this and actually get involved in finding solutions?
I think that's the perfect question to end on. This deep dive was really just a starting point, a way to spark your curiosity and get you thinking about climate change in new ways. But now it's up to you to take that knowledge and run with it.
I like that.
Think about what aspect of this issue really resonated with you. What questions do you still have? What resources are out there that you can use to deepen your understanding.
It's about empowering ourselves to become informed citizens, right?
Exactly. And remember, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to climate change. What works in one community might not work in another, so it's about finding solutions that are relevant to your local context and using your voice to advocate for change.
Right. It's about taking action at both the local and global levels, and remembering that even small actions can make a difference.
Absolutely. Whether it's making more sustainable choices in your daily life, or supporting businesses that prioritize environmental responsibility, or engaging in political advocacy. Every action counts.
Well said. This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into the impacts of climate change. It's a complex and challenging topic. But as we've discussed, it's also one that offers opportunities for innovation, collaboration, and positive change.
It's about shifting our mindset from fear and despair to hope and action. We have the tools and the knowledge to create a more sustainable future. What we need now is the collective will to make it happen.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that wraps up this episode of The Deep Dive. We hope this conversation has inspired you to keep learning, keep making informed choices, and keep advocating for a healthier planet.
Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating topic. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.